ask you something to do with allergies, because it seems to me that recently, I'd say in the last 8 or 9 years, this idea of allergy has become central.
Allergy?
Allergy.
Oh, allergy,
Allergy.
sorry.
Not allergy, allergy. It's become central to what you're doing as a poet. You know,
Yeah,
there
yeah,
are allergies to Desmond Cale and to various other people, Tony
yeah.
Earnshaw. And this idea of embodying someone's life in a poem, it's quite an old-fashioned one, but also you've managed to refresh it and make it new in what you've done in your work. How important to you is this idea of allergy?
I celebrate people who've meant a lot to me who've died. I did it with Mary Cann, with Kavita, with Des, um,
Tony Earnshaw.
Tony Earnshaw, and Tessa, of course. They may not be famous people in their own right, but they meant a lot to me, and they had a profound influence. So in that sense, I suppose, I don't give a toss whether they're famous or not. They were important to me, and I was important to them. And I had a wonderful letter actually from Tessa's parents. Morris sent them a copy of The Awakening, and they wrote me this really touching letter back saying how nice it was for me to have memorialised her, and also that she had a lot of love to give, and they were glad that she's shared some of it with me. So I thought it was very touching. So it does. You see, that's poetry working properly, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. It's come back to my earlier point about it having a function. And in some sort of sense, I suppose, it's easier to talk to the dead than it is to talk to the living, because the living have a response. Whereas, with the dead, it's very fixed and watertight, and it's there and it's finished. And as a poet, you can sort of, I'm thinking of Oldham writing about, say, Freud, or writing about Yeats.
Oh, Yeats,
You've got this sort of tradition of elegies, and in a sense, the elegy invites no response, because it is all to do with your response to the person who cannot respond to you.
My model for a lot of these things is Auden's In Memory of W.B. Yeats, of
Well, I was
course.
getting there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And why that specifically, would you say?
And then he talks to the living right at the end, doesn't he? Where he
Oh, yeah.
says, "In the prison of their days, teach the free man how to praise." Uh,
Number 4, point.
Jules Smith, in his article, mentioned one thing romantics do is go back to childhood memories. So this paper came out in a terrible rush because I was so pissed off with the presents and politicians and life in general. Now, I wrote this thing about my childhood, which is not something I normally do. It's the sort of thing that Dylan Thomas was very good at, but Anyway, this was written. It's dedicated to Ross Taine, who I've known. He's still alive since I was 9. And when we were 14, we formed this, what we used to call then groups, bands, they call them. And he was the drummer with a couple of knitting needles and a plastic snare drum. And I had a Spanish guitar, And anyway, we eventually got electrified.
Was this around about the same time
Play.
Dylan went electric?
This was in the very early 60s when we used to play the Shadows. We'd do the Shadows Walk, and then we sang a few Beatles songs and things like that.
You to demonstrate?
No, I'm not going to. But this was about how it all started. And of course, I failed my 11 plus, so we all went to secondary modern schools and we're all failures and all that rubbish. Well, as you did.
Yeah.
It's called Beginnings for Ross Taine. With the frost inside our bedroom windows, we rose at 8 to school to walk where friends we saw bust to be caned, fresh from fields where we come ducking in frogs and spawn. among eggs nestling in the field behind our houses where the frost was. Before the geography teacher's slipper slapped and the fags where he sent us behind the boiler house to smoke. And there we dreamed of the older quiffs, Winkle Pickard and the pics of FBI. There we learned the bass lines and drum, friendship and the echo chamber of our future lives. And from this nettled, tangled, pond-driven beginning of a frost-given start, we became once journalists and poets, gifted dreamers, failed people, winkle-pickard and poor. And from the frost inside the window and the fire that lit the hearth, where I read Baudelaire and knew my mother's pain, here was panic practiced, tragedy, gaiety, love, and the beginnings of boredom casting its shadow.
Could you read Moving from the South?
Moving from the South.
Because it seems to me that it sort of ties together.
Well, that again, I suppose, yes, that's going back to childhood, isn't it? Yeah. This is dedicated to Tony Flynn, because Flynn was a northerner who moved south, and I was a southerner who moved north. But we met in Hull. Moving from the south for Tony Flynn. I took for granted the thrush and the wren would walk the woods at the house end in gentle doggedness. And at the end of what would have been enclosure, I took the narrow lanes and walked barefaced to the world, noting the cuckoo and the crushed spitfire in the field of our school. Again I walked the lanes and those that were lanes, and noted the tractor and the car. Then one summer, among the bales, with Hardy in hand, came disturbance, and I moved from this vast path which I'd loved. Now, 40 years in the north, rooted with crag and lum, and dogged with difficulty, politicians in the south move in darkness, like desert birds, born of a flight that ends in banality. Now disturbance is both north and south. But here on Adol Crag, back against an old oak, with Hardy and the Argent stars, I rest safe in her shadow.
I guess the Hardy you mentioned here is the poet Hardy.
Oh yeah.
Rather than the novelist Hardy.
Well, actually, I read what's the one? Blimey, it's years ago, isn't it? Anyway, I was working on a farm one summer. I was reading Tessa D'Urberville's, I think, and I had straw in my hair. I was eating my lunch, my sandwiches at lunchtime, and reading Hardy. It's like bliss, like the Garden of Eden.
There was a sort of a technical question I wanted to ask, which sort of came to my mind with that last point, and it was the fact that you start all your lines in uppercase with capital letters. It's something that poets don't do anymore. I'm not suggesting that it's wrong, because there's no wrong or right. I wonder if you could say a few words about why you do that, why you feel that you need to start every line with a capital letter.
One of my favourite contemporary poets. It's David Constantine who does that as well. And he it's always struck me as being a contemporary romantic. That's one of the reasons. But I don't know. I mean, the other reason is that it just became a habit.
Is it also something to do with the integrity of the line?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, I think
it draws attention to the fact that it's a unit.
I think. Well, that's right. You're quite right there. I think every line should stand on its own. Every line should have its own meaning and integrity. And if you start using lowercase, then certain lines lose their integrity. And I think that's if that sounds makes sense to you.
Yeah. So what would you make of Cummings then? Because Cummings wrote entirely in lowercase.
I can't stand hearing Cummings.
That's funny because we were talking to Milner last week, and he was saying that he always his most recent poems are really influenced by Cummings. He's done away with punctuation and everything.
I think it's just silly. I mean, sorry.
Do you see yourself as committed to free verse? Could you say something about sort of free verse?
Luxury poems are free verse.
Well, they are, but they're free verse, but they're structured.
They've got a different beat in every line.
Yeah.
Well, they're sort of Leventian in that sense. No, Lawrence wrote free verse, but also it had this sort of.
Well, I think Lawrence's poems are brilliant. I mean, there you go. I've never, no. Well, I don't. Again, I don't think poetry is an exercise. Imagine being at school.
The same thing could be said about Ted Hughes.
Yeah, I mean.